The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay on a beautiful windy Wednesday with rain predicted and snow at high elevations. My guest today is Dr. Tiffany Wise-West. Tiffany Wise-West is the Sustainability and Climate Action Manager at the City of Santa Cruz, California. She is a licensed professional civil engineer with over 25 years of experience in municipal environmental planning, programming, policy, and infrastructure development and implementation. Drawing on her interest in innovation and education, she specializes in collaborating across public, private, and academic sectors to deliver impactful and award-winning emissions mitigation and climate adaptation initiatives. Tiffany Wise-West, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thank you, Len. It's great to be here with you.
I spent some time looking through the Climate Action Plan, actually spread over a few weeks here now, since it was the 2030 plan was adopted fairly recently. And I thought we might spend a little time just setting context. I think we're all mostly aware of human-induced climate change as a global problem. What are the impacts on us locally here and on the Central California coast?
Sure, thanks for that question. So being situated on the coastline, nestled between the ocean and the mountains, we really are subject to quite a bit of climate change impacts. Everything from increased intensity and frequency of precipitation to drought. Those two major extremes, of course, increase burned area and intensity of wildfires, and many others. There are so many other cascading and as well as interconnected impacts related to these hazards. And then, of course, sea level rise, coastal storms and erosion that we have just seen with these January storms. The future is here now with climate change.
Right. It really seemed driven home, especially with the fires and the intensity of those fires that were beyond anything that the firefighters were equipped to contend with. So you are you work for the City of Santa Cruz as a Sustainability and Climate Action Manager. What's your prescribed role in the city government?
Sure. So my role is to work with the internal city departments as well as the entire community on two things. One, emissions reduction, and number two, climate adaptation or resiliency. Mm-hmm. And we have our two guiding documents, the Climate Action Plan, which was just recently updated and adopted in 2022, and our Climate Adaptation Plan, which was adopted in 2018, and we actually are going to begin updating that later this year.
Oh, so the adaptation plan is due for update already?
It is. We couple our climate adaptation plan with another planning document called our local hazard mitigation plan, which looks at everything, not just climate-influenced hazards. And it's important for us to keep that updated on a 5-year cycle and to have it certified by FEMA. It makes it us eligible for certain categories of pre- and post-hazard mitigation funding, of which we take quite a bit of advantage of. So it's important to keep those documents updated.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I'm used to, having had in the distant past a planning background, I'm used to plans being developed by the planning department. Who develops these plans that you're involved in?
I lead the development of these plans out of the city manager's office. However, we typically, for both the climate action plan and the adaptation plan, we have a multi-departmental team that works on this because these issues span all the departments. And so we work together and I lead the team. And then we also conduct quite a bit of community outreach on these types of planning documents. And I'm, as you mentioned in my bio, I'm very interested in innovative and impactful ways to reach people, particularly people from frontline community groups.
Great. The city has been trying to address climate issues for quite a while. There's a climate action compact between the city, the county, and UCSC. Could you describe what's in that compact?
Sure. So the Climate Action Compact that came about in 2007, as you mentioned, it was between UCSC, the city of Santa Cruz, and the county of Santa Cruz. And the intent was that we would support one another in developing climate action plans and implementing them. Well, we all had done so. As of, 2012 was around the time that kind of Climate Action Plan 1.0 came forward. And since that time, the compact grew into a Monterey Bay Regional Climate Action Compact, where a number of jurisdictions, nonprofit agencies came together on a quarterly basis to really support one another in implementing the plans that we all had adopted. That has since, it's sort of kind of been backed off a little bit, particularly with the advent of a larger collaborative network called the Central Coast Climate Collaborative. So the Monterey Bay Regional Compact is now kind of considered an arm of that broader Central Coast collaborative. With that said, I am also happy to report, however, that there is a kind of a spin-off group called the Monterey Bay Regional Climate Project Working Group, which consists of Monterey County, San Benito County, Santa Cruz County, City of Santa Cruz, and City of Watsonville. And we all came together recognizing that we had mutual priorities, that there were unprecedented funding streams coming from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act, that we would be more competitive if we went together on those mutual priorities for these major grants versus, little Santa Cruz competing against LA. So that group formed just about a year ago. We've just finished some of our governance documents. We've already secured some funding, but we have big plans to bring in lots of funding to our region, specifically around building and transportation electrification and resiliency work.
Great. Wow. Yeah, and that's the part of the strategy, it seems, particularly in local government, when the funding is coming from somewhere else. It's not a local tax base that we depend on, but money that maybe left here, went to the feds, maybe went from the feds to the state, now wherever you have to go to get it, and to be able to collaborate to increase your odds of getting a better share is really good planning.
Well, thank you. We think so too.
Yeah. The city joined with others in a lawsuit against fossil fuel companies back in 2017. Could you tell us what the lawsuit was about and what its status is?
Sure. So we each jurisdiction, there are about a dozen states and cities. We have our own lawsuits going, so we aren't joined together, just to make that clear. Mm-hmm. And we sued 29 different fossil fuel companies for the impacts of climate change. We already know that we have, for example, by the end of the century, if we kind of continue in a business as usual fashion, we have about $1 billion of coastal property and infrastructure that's exposed. We already know that we're experiencing at least $25 million a year in the social costs of carbon. So the costs are very real. They are responsible for it. They were deceitful in their knowledge that climate change was caused by the combustion of their products, and they concealed that and, in fact, embarked upon media campaigns that really did not convey that. So that's what we've been doing. It's still pending. We have had some success in maintaining the venue that will be most appropriate for our lawsuit. I haven't gotten a recent update from our city attorney's office, who is really leading that charge, but I have been working with them over the years since 2017 and supplying, the kind of documentation that's needed. So no major activity right now on that, but I'd be happy to update you when I hear more.
Yeah, I know from the history of, litigation against the tobacco companies, for example, that it took a really long time from the first legal actions to the time that, money was paid out and laws began to change. And I don't expect it to be much different in this case.
No, exactly. And the tobacco case is a very good analogy to what, what's transpired here. But yeah, we're in it for the long haul.
Yeah, I've been following all the revelations about Exxon scientists recognizing that climate change was real and even making predictions about its impacts. And then Exxon just not only buried that information, but chose to do an awful lot of propaganda arguing that information wasn't even true, even though their own scientists had shown that it was true. So it's really going to be interesting to see how those lawsuits progress. With record profits in the past year for the major oil and gas companies, it seems like they're certainly in a position to handle the litigation, handle the liability for this. But we'll see how the courts decide. So the city's doing action on its own, and some of those actions are actually required by the state, like the state requires the city to have a plan, right?
There is not a requirement that we have a plan, actually.
Ah, okay.
Yes.
But the state does require, for example, consideration of things like location of uses relative to the transportation demand for those uses, for example, and that's something that's required.
That's correct. Another example would be organic waste. That is now a requirement as well. That's why in Santa Cruz, everyone has the little curbside buckets where we pick up food scraps, because food scraps go into the landfill and the decomposition of them can produce methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas that's emitted to the atmosphere. So now we collect those and we actually process that material at our wastewater treatment facility into electricity. We take it into one of our anaerobic digesters where microbes process that edible food waste, and then that process releases methane, which we capture, and we have a cogeneration unit at our wastewater treatment facility that we're able to convert that into electricity that's used on site. So that's our solution for organic waste collection. Other jurisdictions do composting or potentially other ways that can keep that methane out of the landfill.
Yeah, the fact that we have the capacity to add that additional organic waste to the digesters is amazing, because it's an opportunity. I know that the generators have been there for a while. I've seen them in years past. And these generators are running off of the gas produced by the digesting wastewater. That is the anaerobic decomposition of that wastewater. And at the same time they're producing electricity, the heat's recovered off the engines to keep that digestion process going, because it has to be kept warm. And you can all imagine if it was 58-degree water, it slows it down. So they keep it warm, and it makes for a kind of a nice closed loop.
It does indeed.
And the city's been at that for, at least 25 years, I think.
I think so.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So the state does have some policies itself related to climate change. Do we see those state policies reflected in the city's climate action plan?
Most definitely. Let's talk from a broad level just about emissions reduction targets. So let's start there. So we have two targets. One is in alignment with the state's target, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 40% from 1990 levels by 2030. That is the codified state target. However, we also acknowledge that that's actually not quite good enough, that science tells us we need to go faster and harder with emissions reductions. And so we heard that from our community, we heard that from our city council members, and so we also adopted a voluntary aspirational target of carbon neutral by 2035. The state has an executive order on carbon neutrality, but not a codified policy target, and that is carbon neutral by 2045. So we are exceeding the executive order target there. So that's the first place. We are aligned on, and exceed the state targets for emissions reductions. There are other areas where the state is, for example, going to be phasing out the purchase of gas-fired vehicles, right, in 2035. No new sales of that. So we are aligned with that in that, we have a certain percentage of our vehicles in the city that we need to get electrified before that date. So, it's not a one-to-one kind of equivalency to their target, but those are the kinds of things that we are working towards. The organics is another example. I believe we needed to be in compliance by 2025. We are already. And there are others related to transportation. There is a really interesting areas, the renewable energy content on our grid. Again, because of the state target of carbon neutral by 2045, we actually are dialing that back through our Central Coast Community Energy, who will have renewable electricity by 2030. It's at about 60% right now. It'll be at 100% by 2030. So those are some ways that we're in alignment or exceeding what the state's doing with respect to, emissions reduction across all sectors.
Yeah. And you mentioned Central Coast Community Energy. Some people may know it as 3CE because they use that in the name. And you now serve as the chair of the County Commission on the Environment, I understand. Is that right?
No, I'm not any longer. No, okay. That I was 2 years ago in 2021.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Well, back when I was on the commission, where I had the privilege of serving for several years, we were promoting the idea of community choice aggregation. And the Board of Supervisors was not quite confident in the idea yet. But ultimately, it did gain traction. And Santa Cruz County, Monterey County, and San Benito County formed the initial organization. And now, more recently, San Luis Obispo County has joined in that. And that's what we have is an entity that acquires, essentially buys power from wherever they can get it. The utility charges for what's called wheeling, bringing the transmission of that power to our market. And we now have a much higher ratio of renewable energy available in Santa Cruz area than if we were still just going off of the general mix that PG&E provides. So, it's always interesting to me as a relatively impatient person to see that these efforts do really pay off over time. And you really do have to look in the long term to see where it's going to go. So, and I noticed, well, before I go there, because there are so many particulars, there's a lot of detail in the city's climate action plan, and I want to get into those details. But before we do that, I wanted to just cover some sort of general ideas. Before I do that, I want to remind listeners, or if you've just tuned in, that our guest is Tiffany Wise-West. She is the Sustainability and Climate Action Manager for the City of Santa Cruz. And we're talking about the city's Climate Action Plan and related topics. So the adopted Climate Action Plan is meant to guide policy through 2030, the current plan. What are the guiding principles in that plan?
Thank you for asking that. I would say top of mind is really equity in all policies. We really spent a lot of time, effort, and partnerships ensuring that what we put forward would not have adverse impacts on frontline communities, historically underrepresented and underserved groups. In fact, we took the position, this philosophical position, that any action that we ran, we developed an equity screening tool. We had 12 compensated equity advisors from our community that helped us to develop this tool. And we took this kind of principled approach that we would not accept any action that would create any harm and to historically underrepresented, underserved peoples. And if we found through our equity screening tool that it did, we needed to either rewrite it or we needed to add a mitigating action. For example, building electrification. There could be costs involved with that, capital costs, even though there's savings in the long run. We knew that we needed to make sure that anything that we put forward policy-wise or programmatically address the cost issue first for low-income people. So equity is one of the highest principles in the plan. There are a number of different guiding principles that are articulated in the plan, but I would say that is kind of the highest one. The other pieces is that we know that there are co-benefits to emissions reduction, so we're always looking for the win-wins on whether it's public safety, health. Maybe there are costs, that can be reduced through some of these efforts. And so those were other pieces. Where do we have win-wins that is going to make this really appealing for the community to really kind of take charge and get involved? And then I would say that is another, the kind of maybe the last one that I want to mention is that it's really going to take everyone to do their share for us to really achieve the targets that are in this ambitious climate action plan. We all have a role. The city can't do it alone. We need partner agencies. We need individuals and households to take a look at what they're doing. And so we knew we also needed to provide information and tools for people beyond the wonky plan that can, be lengthy and steeped in a lot of terminology that is maybe what you and I may understand as, right. Former planning and current planner, right? And so to get at that piece, we did a couple different things. Number one, we have I love this page. We have an climate education page that spans a number of different topics, and it gives you what we call the short and sweet. If you just want a 5-minute video that's credible information, or maybe you want to do a deep dive and you want more. So we give a couple resources for each topic. And then the other thing that we're very excited about and been promoting in the community right now is Resilient Santa Cruz, which is part of a Central Coast launched platform that's aimed at helping people to understand what their carbon footprint is and then help them tailor and take action and commit to strategies where they can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and lower that footprint. It's an online platform. It's really easy to use. It's geared towards if you're a renter, okay, here's the set of actions that are tailored for you. If you're a young person, here's what's there for you. And we have about 100 prizes that we've been giving out since November. And they're good prizes, like $100 gift cards to local businesses and bikes. Just to encourage people to get onto the platform. So it's Resilient Central Coast. You can do a search for it, and you'll automatically come to the Santa Cruz page once you type in your address. So really encourage people to check that out. Got to give a big shout out to Ecology Action, who's our partner on this, who really, we had this idea back in 2018 to launch something like this. I get calls every day from people in the community. How do I plug in? I don't know where to start. And I've been wanting to launch something like this for some time, but it was out of reach due to cost. Ecology Action came in and campaigned across the Central Coast so that it got deployed, and it brought the cost down for the individual jurisdictions to make it really feasible. And so I'm really excited about the potential for that. You can form teams and compete. We can do custom competitions. There's a lot of potential there. So between now and Earth Day, we'll be giving out all these prizes every couple weeks.
Great. And that's called Resilient Central Coast, is that right?
That's the broader platform, and ours is Resilient Santa Cruz. And if you go to our climate action planning website is cityofsantacruz.com/climate action plan, you can get a link from there.
Great. Terrific. And this interview will end up as a podcast, and we can put all those links up there, and they will be on our website within a week. So if you're thinking, what were they saying again? I want to know more. Check our website in 1 week, and it'll be up there. You'll see it. That's ksqd.org. So there's a lot of pieces of this plan, and you've got things that you call measures and other things you call actions. What's the difference?
So the measures are higher level. Those are the things that we actually measure, like, for example, number of vehicles that are registered as electric, number of households that take advantage of a particular rebate, those kinds of things. The actions then are the specific policies, projects, programs that help us to reach the measures. So, for example, I think we have maybe less than, I think about between a dozen and 20 measures, but we have 154 actions to back up those measures that give more of the specifics.
Great. Well, we're going to take a really short break. We'll be right back with Tiffany Wise West. And if you're just joining us at Talk of the Bay on KSQD, my guest is Tiffany Wise West. She is the Sustainability and Climate Action Manager at the City of Santa Cruz. The city itself has some facilities, and you already mentioned how at the wastewater treatment plant they're processing not just wastewater but also food waste that's collected around the city to produce methane, which is run through some generators, which produce electricity to run the wastewater treatment plant, which is, kind of making it almost its own self-sufficient operation to a great extent. And anyone who's driven around or walked around the city facilities probably has noticed some pretty big arrays of photovoltaic panels. What else is the city doing to reduce its carbon footprint in its own operations?
Sure. Thank you for that question. We have over a dozen solar arrays right now. We produce, we're approaching 2 megawatts of solar capacity at our facilities, and we keep bringing more online, which is really, good for our bottom line, good for the environment. So that's great. I also want to highlight, we right now have been working on our fleet electrification plan, but in the meantime, we have really been taking advantage of all of the 3CE, the Air District funding, and other funding that's been available to electrify our fleet. In fact, next week we're having our ribbon cutting for our first all-electric refuse truck, and we're the first in the county to have one of those. So that's really exciting for us. We are really edging into electrifying our medium and heavy duty fleet. We already have done a pretty good job on our passenger vehicles and providing the charging infrastructure needed. We have down at our corporation yard 16 level 2 chargers. We've just installed our first level 3 or DC fast charger, and we have a second one coming right now. And I have to give big props to our facilities division of the Public Works team, the Public Works Department, for really staying on the cusp, staying on top of the funding, and really just stacking and leveraging all the funding that's out there to make this charging infrastructure happen. As part of that fleet electrification plan that will be done in the next couple months, that's going to really give us our roadmap for, in a more systematic kind of way, how we need to address the charging infrastructure and then the investments in the vehicles and so forth. I also want to give a shout out to our Parks and Rec department, who has already electrified over a third of their landscaping equipment, which is another big thing. We have funded that we have actually an internal carbon fund that all the departments pool money into based on their energy usage. It's prorated. And we give internal grants for carbon reducing projects each year. It varies the amount, but last year was about $40,000, and we've given 3 of those grants for landscaping electrification equipment. So there's a few things that we have going on that it really get at kind of our biggest areas: transportation usage, gas usage, obviously, and then energy usage in our buildings and facilities.
Mm-hmm. And I know that both water treatment and wastewater treatment are pretty big electrical demands.
Yes.
Have they been able to do? Obviously, there's cogeneration going on at the wastewater treatment plant. Have they been able to do other measures as well?
Definitely. Our water department had one of the first solar arrays in the city, and also has PV on our Bay Street reservoir tanks, which offsets some of the energy a large amount of energy that's used to at the pump station there to move water. I have to again give, our departments are just amazing. Our water department is really doing cutting edge work on understanding how climate change will impact water supply and reliability. And they're doing some major infrastructure projects where they really are taking a look at not just, where there are opportunities for renewable energy, but what about in our material selection and our design? So, that gets to like building envelope and material selection, what kind of concrete and so forth. And so they're really pushing the envelope there. But as you mentioned, they are, wastewater and water are our 2 big energy hogs at the city. So it is something that, we have to remember that water conservation is energy conservation. That's why, that's not just, we don't just want people to conserve water because it's a precious resource, but it also reduces energy usage and, from extracting it to moving it around and treating it, which are those big electricity costs that the water department, faces.
Yeah. And you mentioned kind of the indirect energy costs, like when we purchase something or the city purchases equipment, or anyone really in the city purchases anything that comes from somewhere else, there's embodied energy in that. So we're, even if we went to zero within the city limits, we're still contributing to consumption elsewhere because everything that we consume has to be made with energy, and there's probably some carbon footprint associated with that, for virtually everything, from asphalt pavement, concrete, right on up to, electronics and the food that we eat. So that's interesting that the city departments are even paying attention to that aspect of it. And I know there's measures that deal with buildings and electricity, and there's measures that deal with transportation, and there's also measures that deal with climate restoration. But I wanted to go at the building ones first, just to give us an arbitrary order here. I think it was in 2020, the city adopted a policy prohibiting natural gas connections in new construction. And I wonder if you could talk about the reasoning behind that policy, and if you know, how is it working?
Yes. So again, pointing back to Central Coast Community Energy, because we have, right now 60% renewable electricity and eventually 100%, that is the rationale as to why we want to electrify buildings. And so, yes, back in 2020, we adopted a natural gas prohibition in new construction. There are some limited exceptions to that. And it actually has been implemented very well. We have not had major issues with that, and it's been pretty smooth. What is going to be the more challenging is getting to existing buildings. We have modeled that in order to meet our targets, we will need to electrify about 30% of residential buildings and about a quarter of commercial buildings by 2030. That's less than 10 years away.
Yeah,
it's going to be
ambitious.
Yes, it is. It's going to be a big lift, and there are a lot of questions that aren't answered. For example, around transformer upgrades. Right now, the wait time is 6 months from PG&E for a transformer upgrade, and if you're going to be adding electric appliances, electric equipment, you may have to upgrade your panel. The transformer may need to be upgraded. So that's a serious thing that we are trying to figure out with Central Coast Community Energy and other jurisdictions. And there are lots of other questions, so how we just went to council in January with what we're calling our roadmap. This is what we're going to do over 2023 to bring some options to council, to do the engagement in the community, which we started actually last year. We had 4 listening sessions with all kinds of different stakeholder groups, including, builders, contractors, developers, designers, as well as even like healthcare folks and other community benefit organizations. Really tried to do some broad-based engagement to understand initial concerns. And really, it comes down to costs and grid reliability are really the 2 major things that we're hearing. And coming back to, the federal funding that's coming, that's why it's so important we don't miss this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, because we cannot bring forward, in my opinion, a policy or programs that are not, heavily rebated. It's just not going to work for our community. We can't ask people that are struggling to pay the high rents and housing costs here to, hey, you got to do this also. So we're really trying to, look to Berkeley, San Mateo, and other places that have taken a practical, stepwise approach to existing buildings and start getting on that track. We do not envision this is going to be like a one and done kind of policy thing like the new buildings was. This is going to be a series of stepwise kind of things that get phased in, both from a policy perspective and from heavily incentivized voluntary programs. And again, Central Coast Community Energy is going to be a big partner in this. I mean, we're already been participating for years in their working group on this topic. So a lot going on in the building electrification space. It's something that, all the jurisdictions it's a mutual priority for all of us. Yeah.
And your point about electrification of existing buildings is well taken. I mean, if you go into social media, there's all kinds of nefarious sources saying all kinds of sort of hysterical things about electric versus gas stoves, for example. I like the aesthetic of cooking with gas, but I'm a renter, and the place I live has an electric stove, and it works. So, it is, there's that thing of like, well, what are you used to? Is that really that important? How do we adjust? But I have seen installations here in Santa Cruz of heat pump water heaters that were improperly installed. And I figure it's just learning curve, but if you install it in such a way that it's always in backup mode, it's not a heat pump. Just to see that it takes time sometimes for people in the professions to realize that there's more to it than just slap it in the same way you would have done the old kind. Doesn't always work the same. But I trust that people will eventually learn. And I've been involved in a number of projects because I've worked in the building field for my career for variable refrigerant flow heat pump systems, and I'm completely sold on them. They're incredible in their performance, their efficiency, and their reliability, and their simplicity. I'm hired to find problems in new construction so that when the building is handed over, the problems have all been cured first. That's my job. And every job I've worked on that had variable refrigerant flow heat pump systems, the problems with the heat pump systems have been nil. There are other issues, other things come up, but those systems are really amazingly designed and well integrated with their controls. And it's, I'm always like going, well, gee, why'd they hire me? Like the dominant thing I'm supposed to test in this building works fine. And I might find other things elsewhere, but they're great. And that electrification is great, but if we're dealing with the sustainability of existing buildings, especially rental housing, it's always posed a challenge because so often tenants are paying for the energy they use, so the owners don't have any economic incentive to improve the efficiency of the building. So are there any, I don't know if anything has been determined in the plan to try to address that, but I'll ask.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, and that actually is called out in our plan, is to look at that split incentive. How can we incentivize for both the renter and for the owner? So you bring up something that is part of what we're looking at with not just building electrification, but also, continuing to promote renewable energy and solar. How can we split the incentive there between those two? And, you also brought up a good point, and that I wanted to kind of link back to that equity piece, is that we really want to start with affordable housing, with this electrification, existing building electrification, not just because of the emissions reduction piece, but also, fires. The number one cause of fires in homes are these little pilot lights that we've got from stoves and from heaters and from, our water heaters. And so the safety element in a lot of the affordable housing, especially multifamily, they don't even have vent hoods, right. So, and they're operating gas ranges. So, there's some low hanging fruit there. If we can come in fully incentivized, do it right, like you said, because that's the place to start. And to your point on the installation, we also recognize there are supply chain issues we need to make sure are addressed. There's workforce development and training, which I'm actively right now working on scoping a workforce development project with Cabrillo, the County Office of Education, Central Coast Energy Services down in Watsonville. So, there's a lot of pieces to this besides just like, let's get the money and electrify homes. We need to create the supportive conditions that are going to make that really happen in a very positive kind of way.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge. And I know some jurisdictions have looked at, time of sale changes, for example, which admittedly adds to the cost. But if you couple a mandate with an incentive so that it picks up a big share of the cost, it starts to work out to still be a win-win.
Exactly.
Transportation accounts for 69% of local greenhouse gas emissions. That's a much bigger number than it would be in places like, say, Minnesota, for example, where there's so much more going into heating and air conditioning. What policies is the city pursuing to deal with transportation?
There's so many. So let's start with active transportation. That's huge. We're really trying to get those who can shifted over to bikes, walking, as well as public transit. The metro, of course, the rail trail is going to be a huge supporter for those who want to take active transportation or public transportation. So that's the first piece. And there's so much activity happening there. Bike shares coming back this summer, right? So that's going to be great for us. We already have incentives for e-bikes. So lots happening there. Another action that we have in our plan is how can we keep jobs local? We need to make sure that land uses are suitable so that we can still draw industry and commercial businesses that'll support good paying jobs here so that people don't have to drive over the hill to go to their job or whatnot. Another thing that we have is supporting teleworking and satellite working sites to the extent possible. We recognize not every job can do that, but maybe we can assist businesses that need some help with that in order to put that in place. So those are just a few snapshots on, kind of where we're focusing on transportation, but really it's all all of the above kind of strategy on transportation. And I'm really excited to see that there's been a lot of momentum and coordination with the Regional Transportation Commission, the Metro, and so forth to really help to make public transportation something people want to do, not just students, right? And maybe people of lower incomes, that, it really can be a really great way to. I just took the bus a couple weeks ago on Equity Transit Day, and I was like, this is so relaxing and quiet. Yeah. And, I really enjoyed the experience, and I hadn't rode on the bus since I was in grad school. So I'm really excited to see that there seems to be a lot of coordination happening on that front.
Yeah. Yeah, I took the bus for the first time in a while just a few days ago to go meet my wife because we were headed out towards South County, and I'm up here in Santa Cruz, and she was in the center of the county. So it didn't make sense for me to drive out there and then have to pick up the car on the way back. And I just took the bus, and it was so easy. Mm-hmm. It was like it was all of 1 minute late, which for commute hours I thought was pretty impressive. And then it tells you every stop, and it's like it's pretty simple. You just say, oh, well, there's my stop. Okay, you get off.
Exactly.
You got there, and it's very affordable, and so it works. And right now there's an initiative by the Metropolitan Transit District called Reimagining Metro. So they're engaging, as you said, in a planning process right now to try to figure out how to do with what funds they have to make Metro as effective, efficient, and appealing as possible. So, as you said, all these different jurisdictions and entities in our region are cooperating towards some common goals, which makes it so much easier, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
Wonder if you could talk about the climate restoration measures that are in the plan.
Yes. So a lot of these revolve around carbon sequestration, or how we can fix carbon in the earth, on our soil. And so we call for planting 3,000 trees. We call for doing compost application. There actually is a state requirement around compost application. So determining where we can procure and apply compost around the city. There is some work on native vegetation and restoration in that sense, but really we're talking about carbon sequestration when it comes to the restoration measures and actions.
Mm-hmm. And so I know from what little I've learned about carbon in the soil that the soil is critical there. And you mentioned composting as one of those strategies. But you mentioned 3,000 trees. Where would those trees go?
Sure. So the city did adopt a street tree plan 2 years ago, and I think they identified in that plan about 2,000 suitable sites on our streets and our medians and so forth. Now, there is difficulty there in maintaining those trees, right? Watering them, getting the pruning done. So that's something that we definitely need to address. We need to also enlist the community members, because street trees that are, say, in the right of way in front of your house, we actually expect the homeowner to take care and water those trees. So I think there's a big education component that's needed there. So lots of opportunities on the street trees, but on the Parks and Recreation work plan for the Climate Action Plan for this year is to also develop an urban tree master plan. And so not just taking the good work from the street tree plan, but looking even broader. So that's supposed to be happening, and I think we'll be able to identify the rest of those sites. And again, it's not all going to happen on public property. We need to also, bolster and incentivize our street tree program that we give trees to homeowners, and really make clear what the expectations are for maintenance and the type of tree and so forth. So that's what's happening there with trees. I know 3,000 is a lot.
Yeah. And I know, some cities have done sort of incidental to really traffic management measures. So, for example, putting sort of curb bump outs where they plant, a tree in that piece that sticks out into the street a little bit, which the intention of it is to keep traffic slow, to make sure they take the turn slow enough so they see if there's pedestrian crossing or whatever, and also to provide shorter distances on some intersections for pedestrians or bicyclists to cross, which makes it safer, especially for people who are less physically able to walk fast when they see that the light's getting ready to change. So that integrating the tree planting with those types of measures has been done elsewhere. I don't know if that's something that the city is really looking at yet, but it could happen, I suppose.
It could happen. It's not something that I know is actively happening right now, but also there's a lot of planning going on across the city, and I don't necessarily have my fingers in all of it. So, right. I'm sure that, our transportation folks are definitely, they're kind of on the leading edge of, I would say, planning, around these kinds of things, and perhaps are considering those kinds of, like bulb outs, I think you were describing.
Bulb outs, yes. Thank you.
Yes.
That's the right
Yes.
term there. It can take, as you mentioned, it can take several years for the tree's root system to get established, and you do have to continue to water it through that phase because it doesn't have deep enough roots to manage through the dry months until then. So, I mentioned before, there are a lot of indirect emissions for the things we consume, emissions that occur outside of Santa Cruz and often outside of North America. Does the Climate Action Plan try to address any of that, or have any actions that would reduce the consumption that accounts for those emissions?
Yes, definitely. One of the actions that we called out in the plan was to actually conduct a consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions inventory to account for those, which we actually were able to do so with a master's student who did her thesis on this. And we found that we actually, on a per person basis, right now we have around 4.2 metric tons per person that's being emitted. But when you consider the life cycle emissions, it's more like 16 metric tons per person, 4 times more. So that really puts it into context. Also, we heard from our community that we originally were not addressing that enough beyond just calling for that that emissions inventory. And so we did build in encouragement of, say, for example, plant-based food choices and meals. Now, we can't put policy in place to regulate what people eat, but like, for example, internally at the city, we can make buying choices that, where we can promote plant-based food. So that was one area where we will really promoted. Carbon sequestration is another area that was not accounted for in the greenhouse gas emissions accounting. And then in terms of travel and some of the other embedded, transportation of goods and those kinds of things, it's really about buying local as much as possible, buying locally produced food and goods as much as possible so we can avoid the energy and transportation emissions that are needed to produce and transport goods and services from overseas. So we have, a lot in our plan, not a lot, but, actions in our plan related to buying local. So 2 examples, plant-based, buying local, but also really the education piece is so important so that people can understand that, that buying from Amazon every couple of days, it's so easy to do, it's so convenient, but there's a cost to that. And, we're experiencing those costs, like I said, in that $25 million in, medical costs due to asthma or whatever it is, here in our community, we're experiencing those costs already.
Yeah. Well, we just have a couple minutes left.
Yes.
So, Tiffany, I want to give you an opportunity to say anything else you'd like to say about the city's climate action plan, about your work, and about where our listeners can find out more information.
Well, thank you. Something we didn't talk a lot about was climate adaptation. And, with what has happened on Westcliff Drive, That has really ignited our community conversation around, what is the fate of Westcliff Drive and our coastline. So I really want to encourage folks to check out. We have so many really great tools and resources to understand not just the impacts across all the various segments of our coastline and what we're projecting. We have state-of-the-art modeling, virtual reality tools to be able to look at that, but also what are our options and what are the trade-offs with those options. And as I said, we have some thing called a kind of a climate hazard to solution story maps that helps people to really kind of understand that in a systematic kind of way. We have a virtual reality sea level rise app that's available on mobile phone or on your computer in Spanish and English. Really immersive tool to help folks to understand, like, this is what we're projecting. Here are the different options that are available to us, and take a survey and tell us what you prefer. At any rate, I would say you could go to find more about all of our coastal climate planning at cityofsantacruz.com/resilient coast.
Great. Tiffany Wise-West, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for coming on Talk of the Bay.
Thank you, Len. It's been really enjoyable.